Another key issue around social class is poverty. And in this briefer video, we are going to talk about why poverty is so persistent and how poverty can act as a trap. This is very much connected to those issues of neoliberalism and Keynesianism talked about in the last video, but we're going to focus on being poor and poverty in itself. So we can think of first of all, what does it mean to be in poverty? The official poverty measure is usually calculated by how much it is to buy a particular set of items that you need to survive in a year at the given rate. This is calculated by the US government, and it's usually pretty low. I mean, it's something like for an individual like $15,000 a year. That's not nearly enough for most people to survive on. But that's the official poverty measure, and then they do it by household. We'll look at this during our discussion period. What is our current poverty rate? And we see that from this chart that while it went down in the 1960s and 70s, it's fluctuated a good bit, but that almost 15% of our society live in poverty, and 5% live at 50% below that federal poverty level, which is really low. I mean, that means they have half of that income that the government says is in poverty, and that number is already pretty low. The thing about poverty is that it's very difficult to get out of. Right? Poverty sticks to us. In our society, part of the problem is that we tend to focus on individuals. We see somebody who's poor, and we often say perhaps that they're lazy or had bad luck. Essentially, we argue that the poor deserve their poverty. But the truth is that poverty acts as a trap. It's very expensive. We can come up with ways of thinking about this, of why poverty is so difficult to get out of. For example, many people are poor, have bills they have to pay, and don't have the money to do it. They can't get a loan from a bank because they might have poor credit rating, but they're payday loan companies. These people will give you a short-term loan on the agreement that you'll pay it back with exorbitantly high interest on the day of your payday. So if I give you $10 and the interest on that loan is $1 a day, or 10%, you have that loan for 5 days, you come back, you owe me $15, not 10. Right? And that's at 10%. Payday loans are sometimes like 200% and 300% interest. That's enormous. You end up paying a lot more than you're loaned, but in the short term, you might have been able to cover rent or your cell phone bill. There's lots of things in our society that actually are more expensive for poorer folks. For example, maybe you want to get an apartment. Well, what does it require to get an apartment? Usually what they call a month and a half. You have to pay a full month's rent and the rent and half of that. So that's a big barrier to getting into an apartment. Many poor folks, if they lose their apartment or their housing, they have to rely either on cars or on weekly hotels, which cost a fair amount more, but it's a roof over your head because you can't get into that apartment. So poor folks often have to make particular trade-offs between being close to work or paying to travel to work, paying for gas. So part of what's happened since the 1980s, as we saw in the last video, is that we have higher structural poverty. It's meaning that poverty is really built into our system. What this means is that there's a lack of jobs and a lack of good jobs in society. Increasingly, this might be more and more of an issue. This is why we see some people proposing things like universal basic income, which might be a good opportunity for a policy paper. Increasingly, we rely more on automation. Jobs have gone to countries with cheaper labor. And there's also lack of jobs that help us get out of poverty. Many people who work in retail industries, they have jobs, but they still live in poverty because the pay isn't nearly high enough for them to meet their weekly needs. Keeping in mind, people in poverty can have income. So some of the takeaways from our discussion of social class We've seen an increasing class project since the 80s. It meant that the capitalist class has pursued its interests over the working class, and the working class is in a very weak position. What this looks like is deregulation, stagnant social security, decline of worker power, and global production networks, so companies can get away from the pesky workers who want to advocate for themselves. Poverty is a persistent problem. We tend to frame it as an individual issue, but it's actually built into the structure of our society. And actually, it's pretty good for some corporations to have poor people out there, because that motivates others to work for less than they might think their value is worth. We'll dig into poverty and why it's such a trap more in our discussion this week.